The purpose of this video is to demonstrate the correct procedure for aligning the transmission system of the double disc 1300 and double disc 1600 spreaders. This gearbox alignment procedure should always be performed or reviewed during maintenance when the transmission system is completely disassembled. To do this, we will first quickly disassemble the entire transmission system of the machine, as well as its rotors, for a better view of the procedure as a whole. Disassemble and remove the transmission system with the rotors to facilitate the process. Remove the output regulators and plates, paying attention to the markings on the parts that indicate their right and left sides, which will facilitate reassembly. Continue disassembling the plates, rotors, and gearboxes. We will now begin assembling the transmission system, identifying the correct positions of each gearbox. First, it is important to identify the correct side of the central gearbox. To do this, it is advisable to use two combined methods. First, the heads of the Allen bolts must be facing up. Second, turn the main shaft counterclockwise. From the assembler's point of view, the side shafts should rotate backward as shown in the image. To identify the correct position of each of the side gearboxes, we suggest using eccentric agitators. Which is the correct side for mounting the agitators? To answer this question, we will use a standard M12 nut with a right-hand thread and a pitch of 1.75 millimeters. Try to bolt the nut onto each of the agitators. The one that works, in other words, the one where the nut bolts on clockwise, will be the agitator to be mounted on the right side of the machine. Consequently, the other agitator should be mounted on the left side. Once we know the correct sides of the agitators, we will use them to identify the correct mounting position of the side gearboxes. With the first side gearbox in hand, check which of the agitators can be screwed onto the upper shaft of that gearbox. Let's start with the agitator on the right side. Note that the agitator does not bolt onto the gearbox shaft. Consequently, the other gearbox should be mounted on the right side of the machine. Once the correct mounting positions for all gearboxes have been identified, we can now move on to mounting the side gearboxes with the central gearbox. Pay attention to the alignment between the bushing hole and the gearbox shaft hole for inserting the fixing bolt. Another point to note is to correctly insert the rectangular key into the central gearbox shaft so that it fits correctly into the bushing slot. Repeat this process to assemble the other gearbox. After assembling the side gearboxes and tightening the bushing bolts, perform a final check by turning the central gearbox drive shaft counterclockwise, assembler's point of view. The upper shafts of the side gearboxes should be turning in opposite directions and away from the center of the machine, which would be the direction of fertilizer or seed distribution. To facilitate identification of the gearboxes and the correct direction of assembly, we suggest marking each one. With the help of an assistant, position the transmission system on the base of the machine's transmission support to begin the process of aligning the gearboxes. Insert the central gearbox mounting bolts and nuts, but do not tighten them completely. Next, insert the bolts for the side gearboxes, also without the respective nuts. It is important to push the transmission system onto the base until it reaches the end of the support, eliminating any space or misalignment between the gearboxes. This will be achieved by eliminating any spaces between the side gearboxes and their respective mounting bases. To do this, when inserting and tightening the bolts, we will use shims whenever necessary. We will begin by identifying the need to use shims on the side gearboxes. To do this, we must measure the clearance at each bolt fixing point with the aid of a blade gauge. Always start with the 0.2 millimeter blade. Always pass the gauge blade between the gearbox and its base. In this case, the 0.2 millimeter blade passed with ease. We must then increase to the 0.4 millimeter blade. This new blade still passes easily through the gap, which leads us to increase the thickness of the gauge blade again, this time to 0.5 millimeters. Note that with this measurement, the blade passed through the gap, already snagging on the sides. Increase the thickness of the blade once more, now to 0.6 millimeters. To make sure of the actual size of this gap, with the 0.6 millimeter measurement, the blade no longer passes through the gap. This confirms that the gap in this case is 0.5 millimeters. With the help of a drawing or schematic sketch, note the gaps found at each point to help you with the final tightening of the side and center gearbox mounting bolts. Move on to the next point to be checked for clearance, always starting with the 0.2 millimeter blade. Pass the 0.2 millimeter blade of the gauge through the gap. Note that it passed, which leads us to increase the thickness of the blade. Select the 0.4 millimeter blade and pass it through the gap. It continues to pass through, but now scraping a little on the sides. Increase the blade thickness again, this time to 0.5 millimeters. Note that it continues to pass through, but even tighter. Increase the blade thickness once more, this time to 0.6 millimeters. With this measurement, the blade did not pass through the gap, which leads us to conclude that it corresponds to 0.5 millimeters. Note the gap identified in the sketch. Repeat this process at the other mounting points of the side gearboxes, remembering to mark the measurements in the sketch. Once the need for shims in the side gearboxes has been identified, we must assemble the rotors in the system before including the shims. To facilitate the assembly process, Remove the transmission assembly and place it on a workbench for the assembly of the rotors. Start the assembly with the left rotor. One way to identify it is by the position of the launchers, which should be facing the direction of product launch. Insert the set of roll pins to lock the rotor to the gearbox shaft. Note that the assembly consists of 2 pins, one inserted inside the other, with the slots in opposite positions, as can be seen in the images. Once this is done, we must now insert the assembly into its housing, so that the slot faces the direction of rotation of the gearbox shaft. Align the holes and complete the insertion with the help of a hammer. Repeat the process on the other rotor, making sure that the launchers are also facing the direction of product launch. Assemble the pin assembly and then insert it into the appropriate hole, making sure that the slot is facing the direction of rotation of the gearbox shaft. Align the holes and finish with the help of a hammer. Let's now move on to assembling the dispensers. Start by inserting the locking rings. Then insert the spacers. The latter is not a mandatory item, as some machines may have them and others may not. In the case of this specific machine, as in the disassembly, no spacers were found, so we must reassemble it without them. Next, insert the left covers of the product direction, easily identified by the letter engraved on them. The order of the covers must comply with the following criteria. The bottom cover must be positioned with the holes facing the inside of the machine, and the top cover facing the outside of the machine. Repeat the process on the other side, now with the product direction covers on the right side. Now, replace the transmission assembly with the rotors and regulators on its base in the machine. Insert the central gearbox bolts to make the initial positioning on the base and then align and secure the transmission assembly. Now, let's move on to placing the alignment adjustment shims for the transmission system. Respecting the measurements previously marked on our sketch. Start at the first point on the left gearbox with a 0.5 mm shim. Position the shim and insert the bolt. Now move on to the second point, according to our sketch. At this point, we also need a 0.5 mm shim. Place the shim and insert the bolt. Continue identifying whether or not shims are needed point by point. Note that the last 2 points on this side did not require shims. Place the 4 nuts without tightening them yet, leaving this process for the end. Repeat the process on the other side. On this side, a shim is only needed at one point. Insert all screws and the appropriate shims. Now move on to placing the corresponding nuts, without tightening them completely at this stage. Now move on to assembling the product outlet regulator on the right side, where the final adjustments will be made. Regarding the centering of the gearbox shaft with the regulator hole. To do this, the adjustment points are the vertical movement of the gearbox shaft. And the forward and backward movement of the regulator. These adjustments are possible due to the oblong holes in the fixing bolts. Repeat the assembly and adjustment process on the other product outlet regulator on the left side, paying attention to the centering adjustments through the height of the gearbox. And the positioning of the outlet assembly. Let's now move on to the last step, which is to check whether or not shims are needed on the bolts that secure the central gearbox to its base. To do this, we will again use the blade gauge. As in previous cases, always start with the 0.2 mm blade. As we can see in this image, the blade easily passed through the gap between the base and the gearbox, so we must increase its thickness until the blade no longer passes through the gap. In this case, the next 0.4 mm blade did not pass through the gap, which means that the shim for this point should be 0.2 mm. After inserting the shim, insert the nut as well, leaving it ready for subsequent tightening. Repeat the process at the other fixing points on the gearbox. When there is no need for a shim, insert only the nut for subsequent tightening. Once you have checked the need for shims at the 4 points, tighten all the nuts and bolts on the central gearbox. And finally, lock the regulator covers by inserting the locking rings on both sides, thus completing the assembly and alignment of the transmission system. After that, let's move on to the final assembly of the other distributor components. One point of attention should be the assembly of the agitators. To identify their side, we must pay attention to the direction of the counterclockwise thread. The left side. And clockwise on the right side. Finish the assembly by placing the protective covers on the transmission system. And so we come to the end of another quick operating guide. We hope you enjoyed it and see you in the next video.